The American War for Independence had a lot of these incidents, and George Washington and some of the colonial leaders saw this. And of course, in our day, we would dismiss these as just casual chance events. But when Washington, going back prior to the Francis Scott Key, when Washington had his colonial army trapped on Long Island, it was a ragtag group, and it was all we had as a military force. And we were all trapped on Long Island because the British fleet had come into New York Harbor, and they planned on cutting the East River, cut them off, and then they would invade Long Island and destroy what was left of Washington's army. Washington and the men prayed because it was at night, and they knew what was going to happen the next day when the sun came up. So supernaturally, there just happened to be a fog, a very thick fog that suddenly descended on New York Harbor. Washington and that fledgling army crossed under the nose of the British fleet across to Manhattan and wound up, of course, over in New Jersey and saved the day. Second time that happened is that famous painting you see of Washington crossing the Delaware with all the ice. He had planned a two-pronged attack on Trenton and Princeton area because the British had hired contractors. Their contractor soldiers were called Hessians. And the Hessians had a sentry circle around Trenton. And so Washington planned one crossing in the Delaware to the north, and I think it was General Gates. I think I've mistaken the name of the other guy, but he was to cross south. Well, it turns out that ice in the Delaware River that happened that time, that was part of the Little Ice Age, climate change, and it was cold. And so the southern prong of the attack failed. They couldn't get artillery pieces across the Delaware River because of the ice. So now Washington's left on the north side, wondering, now what do I do now? I've lost half of my force. Well, he crossed Delaware, and just as he was crossing that, a northeast storm came up the coast. And northeast storms were the winds going counterclockwise. The path was offshore, which meant that the wind was from the northeast. So the sentries, the Hessian sentries, are sitting out there protecting the city, supposedly, and sleet began to fall, and the northeast wind blew it into the sentries' eyes. And so they decided, well, nobody's going to invade Trenton, besides we can't see. So they went into the inner city. Washington came down with the wind at his back and entered the city before the Hessians even realized he was there. Those are two instances. The third one, which we just sang about, was that little phrase in our national anthem that says, "the bombs bursting in air." Actually, that was great for us because the more bombs that burst in the air meant they didn't burst on Fort McHenry. And so Francis Scott Key saw that. The British had misfused their bombs. So they timed the fuse so it would blow, but they miscalculated the distance that the shells had to go. And the commander at Fort McHenry at the time, he lost a lot of men because he insisted that American flag was going to fly. And there was just bodies all over the place, and he had a small flag. So in the morning, he had a bigger, massive flag. I think it's still down at the Smithsonian Institute. I saw them working that flag back. It still exists. The women of Baltimore sewed that flag together, and I think it's about 50 feet by something, and how these ladies did that, I don't know. But the commander decided that after that bombardment, he was going to defy the British, and I'm going to fly that sucker up on top of Fort McHenry. So just to let them know, you failed, we won. So that was the spirit that occupied a lot of these people, and they thought in terms of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so today, I want to, in this first divine institution, I'm going to preface it a little bit because of our holiday and I think some neat things about American history. And most of us, because we've gone to a secular educational system, have never been acquainted with some of the things I'm going to bring out. But these were fundamental because the founding fathers of our country thought in terms of the Judeo-Christian framework. But very few people understand why they did that and the background of it. So I hope this will help you have confidence in the Bible when it's ridiculed today and you kind of feel embarrassed sometimes to say, well, the Bible says this, and they ho, 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 Bible. Well, ho, 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 the Bible is a book, a library of letters, poems, and stories, historical reports by 40 people, 66 of these things in the collection, written over 1,400 years in 3 different languages by men who were people at the king level, people at the level of administration in the Persian Empire, all the way down to small businessmen that were fishing on Lake Galilee. Now, you think about this. This is a library of men and women who were at all stages of life, all strata. They had all kinds of experiences, same experiences we have, that God selected and collected this collection, vast collection, and it's internally consistent. Show me one library in the world that has 40 plus authors over 1,400 years that has internal consistency. You won't find it. That's what the Bible is. When we hold this book, we hold an entire library. So I hope this will be confidence building. And so we want to go into some of the background of the colonials, and then we'll get into the first divine institution, which figures on our freedoms. So we'll try to connect all this if you can follow with me here. One of the problems we've got, and it started with a professor, I think he was at Harvard, but he taught students back in the last century that you can't have in public discourse any kind of discussion that gets down into the deeper things of life. I sometimes show this because here's what that guy did, and he's affected public discourse now for almost 50 years. Here's what the issue is. The colonial founding fathers knew this, and they disregarded this etiquette, PC etiquette. But if you'll notice on this 4-layer, I call this the 4-layer cake. A friend of mine has another picture of this where he has an iceberg. And you know most of the iceberg is underwater, just the top of it sticks out of the ocean. And the point is that we often in our everyday conversation, we're talking about issues up here, the social order and what happened yesterday in the news and so on. That's the normal level of discourse. Here's the problem. When you get into real problems in life, that is insufficient. You've got to rely on something underneath that. Example is the whole issue of abortion. You go, well, I'm for abortion, I'm against abortion. But wait a minute, what is right? And that gets down into this first layer. What is just? What is ethics? Well, now the problem is you have to support that. How do you support that? By your view of what the universe is. Is it just a random collection of matter, or is it a creation of an infinite wise God? You can't avoid these things. Well, Professor Rawls thought you could. He said, civic peace in our country can be maintained, watch the language here, can be maintained only if people agree not to make important public decisions by arguing on what is ultimately true. This was followed up by President Obama in his book, Hope and Change, in which he denied the existence of absolute truth. Now, once you do that, you've conceded the ground. Now you have no real basis, and people say, oh, well, the nation's fractured. Well, of course it's fractured because you've got different worldviews competing. So we want to go into this in a little bit more detail. Dr. Stevens, who is a law professor at San Diego University, has written a book, The Disenchantment of Secular Discourse, in which he goes through 5 examples of the U.S. Supreme Court decisions. These are crucial issues. And he says if you look at the arguments that the court uses, you'll see that they try to go into these, get down into these levels, and then they back off. And then they have to deal with something over here, and then they go into, they've got to deal with what's right, what's wrong, what's just, and then they back off. And he gave an example of euthanasia. There was a case that came up before the Supreme Court, about euthanasia. Can you, as a constitutional right, do you have the right to ask a physician to terminate your life? And you may be suffering and maybe pain, and this is a temptation. Can you demand that a physician help you end your life? Well, a court didn't like that because it was written, I think it was California, New York, you might guess where that kind of stuff comes from. And so you have it poorly written. So you have the court's obviously thinking, what do you do with a 14-year-old gal who's depressed because of something in her life? You're going to ask her to go to the doctor and have him end her life at 14? So it just didn't make intuitive sense. So the Supreme Court struggled page after page after page trying to figure out how can we justify our position that that's not right. So they basically had two big arguments, and Stevens shows how neither of one of these arguments really carries weight. So at the very end, here's what they said. This was their justification to say no to unbridled euthanasia. They defined it as the premature ending of life. Now, wait a minute. What does that imply? When you say something is prematurely ended, aren't you in effect saying there is a standard of life? And see what he calls, that's called smuggling. In other words, what happens in a country where we only deal with this, these things can't be avoided, so they're smuggled in through these little ways of phrasing things. Well, the colonial people, our founding fathers never bought into that at all. And when they came to this country, the population in the 1600s and early 1700s, historians tell us some were wealthy, some were indentured servants. We forget that. These were people from Europe. Indentured servants were basically slaves until they paid off their loans. So some were very poor, but, and this is the but they all came with thought-through views of life. What books did they read? To which worldviews did they subscribe? This is the background. Why did the Founding Fathers create the kind of government we have? It wasn't because they got together in Philadelphia and, gee, you believe this, we're going to eeny, meeny, miny, moe the thing, and we'll create a document. As Dr. Gardner showed at the park in Shamrock yesterday, our Constitution is our second Constitution. We had one before called the Articles of Confederation, and it basically was falling apart because it had no strong central government. So here's a quote, one of the historians. This is surprising. You'll never hear this in school because it's embarrassing to a secular faculty. Let's follow this. The revolutionary principles of Republican liberty and self-government taught and embodied in the system of Calvin were brought to America. The vital relation of Calvin and Calvinism to the founding of the free institutions of America, however strange to some ears this sounds, is recognized and affirmed by historians of all lands and creeds. Does that surprise you? Anybody here ever hear this in a public school course? This is basically what he's saying is Calvin is representative of European Protestantism. That's what's going on here. Here's the background of why that kind of thinking came from the Bible. When our country was founded, we had 3 million Americans at the time of the War of Independence. That's the population of the United States, 3 million. Now watch these statistics. Of those 3 million people, 900,000 were Scotch or Scotch-Irish in origin. Now, if they came from Scotland, what worldview and what church had they come out of? The Presbyterian Church. 600,000 were Puritan English. They came out of the people who were opposing divine right. I've showed you several times in speaking, that book that I got from Harvard University Library called Lex Rex. Lex Rex was considered a tract. It's 300 pages long. And Lex Rex is arguing against the King of England's right to tell Scotchmen, how to worship. The king took over the Anglican Church because he wanted a divorce, so he kicked the Catholics out and formed the Anglican Church, or he was part of the Anglican Church, basically. Not all Anglicans went along with that. But what happened was that he decided that he was an Anglican, and to unify all of his kingdom, including Scotland, I am going to compel everyone to worship according to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. And the Presbyterians of Scotland said, you're not going to do it here. And so there was a big, long war between the Covenanters, called Covenanters because they had covenanted to defy the king. Lex Rex is the book they used and the argument they used to show that no civil authority has the right to interfere with our worship, period. He can be called a king, he can be called parliament, or anyone else. So now you see, that was all decided before we started thinking about how to organize this nation. 400,000 others, beside the Puritans, were Germans or Dutch Reformed. So you can see the population favored people who had come out of Northern Europe, and they had been taught. And by the way, they had been taught how to read. You know where universal education started? It started with Martin Luther. You know why he started universal education? Because he wanted people to read the Bible. Remember, printing press came out, Gutenberg. And so there again, God providentially working. So Gutenberg prints the Bible in everyday language. Well, that doesn't help if you can't read in your language. So Luther started teaching that universities and colleges need to get with a common person and teach them how to read. We'll see later what happened to that idea. So here's the relationship now with the Bible. I'm going to show you several verses. These are all familiar with you. But I want you to think about these verses, what they do to thinking about Founding Fathers' concept of the role of government. They believed, particularly the Northern European Protestants, they believed in the depravity of human nature. They believed that we all live east of Eden, meaning original sin. We are made in God's image. We have value, but it has a ruinous nature to it. So human nature has a sin problem, and it affects everybody, from lay people to priests to kings to governments. So they were imbued with this idea, this kind of thing. So let's look at some of what they were reading. Our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. This is Isaiah. We think about, who is Isaiah? Isaiah is one of the prime prophets of the Old Testament who's talking about his own countrymen. And these are people who think they got brownie points with God because they kept a few pieces of the legislation. And he says, you got it wrong. You have a depraved nature. We all have a depraved nature. We all tend to drift. The older we get in Christ, the more we are aware of our own personal shortcomings and sins. So this is not to be a morbid self-reflection thing. It's just a confession of the limitations of our human nature. All our righteousness are as filthy rags. All right, that addresses the nation Israel. Now here's Paul talking about to the Gentiles. Now by Gentiles, he means non-Jews, people who have no exposure to the Bible, people who come out of a pagan background. And he says, and this was important because what this verse teaches is that everyone, including professed atheists, everyone knows basically in their heart of hearts God exists, and I get a little problem with him. When the Gentiles who have not the law, no revelation, and not in contact with the Bible, by nature do the things of the law, and show the work of the law written in their hearts, their consciences all bearing witness. So there's a confession that we can appeal to a common conscience, even though people won't agree whether they have the Bible or they don't. Then we have a third verse I've just picked out, because again, this was in the reading of the Founding Fathers. They all knew this. Here's Paul himself, the guy that wrote most of our New Testament. He's talking about his own inner life. This is not some moral superior person talking down to us. This is someone who shares our nature. And he's confessing that, I known the Lord. I met him on the road to Damascus. And the Holy Spirit's taught me, and that's why I've written these epistles out. But look what he says about his own personal life. I wouldn't have known covetousness unless the law said you won't covet. I am carnal. I'm sold under sin. For what I'm doing, I don't understand. For what I want to do, what I will to do, I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do. Now, we all know, if we're candid, that's our experience, isn't it? As Christians, we try to follow the Lord and what he wants, but that's that struggle that we have on the inside. Now, what I want to do now is we talked about this as the source. Remember the source. Either human nature is depraved or human nature is okay and can be perfected. That depravity is not a bad thing in the sense that the Founding Fathers thought it's hopeless. They didn't believe it was hopeless, so they wouldn't have bothered the effort. The idea of a depraved, fallen nature is that we have to cope with it, and of course the gospel is the only real way of coping with what's inside us. So on the left side of this chart is the idea that human nature is depraved and apart from the gospel, unchangeable. Now, if you believe this, remember the four-layer cake? What is reality? What is truth? What is right? If that is your view of human nature, it has political consequences. It means that if you're constructing a government, you need to have defined, strict laws and punishments. Why? Because we have to be reminded of what is just. So you have to have standards of justice articulated in the legal system. The second thing this idea would compel you to think about is and limit rulers' powers. Remember what I told you about the Scotchman? Remember the Lex Rex, argument over the divine right of kings? That second layer means that when the founding, yes, it's not perfect and it's not highly efficient, but it's the price you have to pay to limit power. So this is why they thought about this. Remember, the Declaration of Independence was an argument against unlimited power of the King of England. The third thing is, and this is kind of interesting because we don't think of this, if we hold to the fact that depravity is universal among men, among all nations, doesn't it follow that we can be threatened by people from another country? All right. The apostles didn't have problems with PA systems. So I'll try to project my voice here. So if you believe the idea that human nature is depraved and it's universal, it's also true of other nations, right? If it's true of other nations, then that tells you we should be able to defend our country, because though we can limit power of our government, we can't limit the power, and we're finding that out with the Chinese. Chinese have a 100-year program of conquering the United States and taking over the world. And they're going to use military, economic, trade, everything else. My son, who works in the Pentagon, was just saying, when we put our DNA into Ancestry.com, you know who owns half of it? The Chinese do. They're building a genetic database of the world's population. Then they can sell it to medical research. I mean, these guys are shrewd. So we have to be suspicious of other nations and be able to think through, how do we defend ourselves? It's not like we're looking for war. It's just we're looking to defend ourselves. On the other hand, on the right side of that chart is what thinkers in Europe thought, and that gave rise to the French Revolution in 1789. Their idea was that you have lax laws and few punishments. You have lax laws and few punishments because you don't really need them if the human nature is basically good. And most important is the second row on that second column. Trust the ruler's good intentions. What that means, they didn't build in limitations. And you remember the blood in the streets of Paris in 1789 when people were facing the guillotine by the thousands. That's what you have. You have an anarchy leading finally, because nobody can tolerate and live in an anarchy. Anarchy always breeds tyranny. And so tyranny is unlimited power. This is why Marxism is so dangerous, because they start out saying we want to reform, we want to reform, we want to improve society. Then they get frustrated, so we're going to wreck the whole thing, and out of this garbage heap is going to somehow miraculously emerge the millennial kingdom. It always has failed. All right, here's the problem though. If that is the case, and our nation is basically founded on a human nature idea like that, what do you do with this? The latest American Worldview Inventory of 2020 by Barna, who operates now at Arizona Christian University, finds that 6 out of 10, almost 7 out of 10, a whopping 69% of Americans see man today as basically good. So there's been a shift in the idea of human nature. This affects politics because, as the Founding Fathers knew, it was grounded on one model, and now we're replacing that model, and it has political consequences. Well, more on that divine institution later, but I want to get now to this divine institution number one, which I'll define and explain in a few minutes here. One of the researchers back in 1984, now, in 1984, we didn't have digital databases, right? No personal computers in 1984. One scholar by the name of Donald Lutz, I think he at the time was teaching at a university in Houston, Texas. He got a bunch of graduate students together, and they manually read through 15,000 documents of the Founding Fathers, looking for what reference material they were looking at for their ideas. You don't get this in any history course that I know of today. They looked at the materials between 1760 and 1805. They found a total, as they read carefully, 3,154 references. And here's what they found. There's the citations they found in the writings of the colonial fathers, and there's the percent of where those citations came from. Notice what's on the top. Imagine today if the leading thinkers of this nation spent 34% of their study time in the Bible. Think that might make a difference? That's what happened to the population that started this country. The Enlightenment thinkers, they weren't the radicals. Of that 22%, people like Montesquieu, John Locke, who himself came out of a Puritan background, accounted. Where you see the Whigs, that was a fallacious term the Brits called the Scottish Presbyterians, and Lex Rex was a lot of that, so 18 references. So I think you can see how there's been a total shift. And this is why, parents, when you send your kids to universities today, let me show you something. There's been a total intellectual shift that's been gone on, and it's been led by the universities. Here's the result of work by John Ellis. John Ellis is a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and he has been in the University of California system. So here's his research going back, asking a simple question. Of the faculties of our universities, if I divide the faculties into those who are conservative and not necessarily biblical, but they at least believe in enduring truth. Versus the liberals who are progressives, they want to improve society because human nature is perfectible. Here's what he found. In 1969, for every 2 conservative faculty members, there were 3 liberals on the staff. In 1999, 30 years later, for every 1 conservative, there were 5 liberals on the faculty. By 2005, for every conservative faculty member at a university, there were 8 progressive liberals on the faculty. And in 2019, for every single conservative faculty member, there's 13 liberals. I just talked to Dr. Gardner from I think he teaches at Towson somewhere here, Baltimore, and a nice black scholar. And I said, "Don't you feel lonely?" And he said, "Yes, I feel lonely. I have very little fellowship on this faculty with anyone that agrees with me." Now, what's really startling is the people who are being hired. For every 1 conservative that is being recruited for a college campus today, 48 liberals. Now, how are you going to get an education with that? There's no diversity. There's no intellectual diversity in that. And you can't learn to think if you don't see the conflict of ideas. If you steadily get one sort of diet, you're going to come out. We don't understand that the students you see tearing down monuments and so on in our streets have been radicalized by their university education, and there are 3 applications here, lessons to learn. Parents, better consider college expenses versus education. Are your kids going to be indoctrinated or are they going to be educated? This is not to say there aren't good campuses. It is just to say, use your tools of research and think through where you're sending your kid. Because they can come back radicalized, and it's going to be a heartbreaking experience for you as a mom and a dad to see the girl or the boy that you've spent years raising suddenly taken over with this kind of nonsense. Young people, here's something for you. You better get training thinking through the great ideas of the Bible and how to defend them, or you are going to be mincemeat when you get on a college campus. You simply have to do that. Back in the days when I went to college, we were beleaguered at my MIT, where, gosh, there was only about 30 of us Christians that we knew of on the whole campus. There probably were more, but in our group. Do you know what we did? We had a file cabinet with folders in it. And when any of the Christian kids took a course, we kept notes about this professor's attack, whether he attacked us as Christians, if he made sly comments in his lectures, and so on. So before we had to, some of these courses we had to take, before we took those courses, we knew going in how that faculty person would teach us, what he would try to do for us, and so forth. So at least it wasn't a total solution, but it surely helped us out. And the other thing, you know what helped us out, is we met together for prayer and the study of the Word of God. Just to know there was other students, so we don't feel like the Lone Ranger, all alone on this hostile situation. Just to know you have some buddies that you can pal with, that you can pray with, you can grieve with, you can laugh with, and so forth. And the third application, not only parents and students, but here, let the third one. If you are an alumni of a university and they come begging money for you, you better find out whether they're still what you thought they were. A couple of years ago, we had Brooke Schertzer come in here and point out a major university right here in downtown Baltimore, when they came for alumni weekend, all the signs about transgenderism and LGBTQ and the Atheist Society, they all disappeared. Why do you suppose those signs were all taken down for alumni weekend? They put right back up on Monday. It's because they don't want to offend the alumni, because what does the alumni give? Okay. So that's what's happened to us, and when we now come to the divine institution, let me define this. We're talking about the first divine institution. But by divine, it's just a label for God's design. but in particular, God's design of human society. Divine institutions are there from the very time of our creation. And they describe the structure that affects every person. They're universal. It doesn't matter whether the person's a believer or not, whether they're a Buddhist, whether they're a Christian, doesn't matter. Every human being has a certain structure. The first divine institution is human responsibility. Some people call it free will. I prefer responsibility because I want to be reminded that I have to live before my Creator. So I have a responsibility how I live my life. And we have, of course, the anchor verse, 2 parts of Genesis 1. We all know this. But in the beginning, let's think about what we're doing here. Let's look through the verse and then think, what is the opposite of this verse? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What's the opposite? He didn't create. That we got here just by accident. Second, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. What's the opposite of that? That we're just animals, evolved animals. You see, in the biblical worldview, we have a creator over the creation. And in the biblical worldview, every person, every single person, no matter what their ethnicity is, has value. And the value is not given by society to the individual. The value is inherent in the individual by virtue of their creation in the image of God. And here's another thought. And in the course I teach at seminary, I always bring this up. One of the great church fathers early on said this about that second verse. He said, I imagine God stooping down into the clay of the Garden of Eden and forming, as he molds this body, patterned after what he knows he has to incarnate himself in. This is not a dog. It's not a horse. It's not anything like that. It's a unique creature made in image of God in order that God himself can come to the earth and incarnate himself, and that's what Jesus Christ is. He is God incarnate in a man. He is called the Son of God, but he's also called the Son of Man. See, that's the absolute uniqueness, and that's the absolute source of value. But now, think about this. Here is one of the quotes from Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, and don't just kiss this off. Marxian thought affects sociology today. Whenever you hear the word class or privilege or dividing people up, that is an idea that started back with Karl Marx. Granted, it's true. He was economic Marxism, but what we got is cultural Marxism. So, here's what he says. A being only considers himself independent when he stands on his own feet. And he only stands on his own feet when he owes his existence to no one but himself. Now, is that an idea? What's the implication? If you seriously believe that, how does that affect your acting versus if you believe you are unique and made in God's image? So when we see these things, think about implications. And this is why when we read our Declaration of Independence, what do you see in this declaration, in this section of the Declaration? And by the way, if you don't have a copy of the Declaration of Independence, I recommend to do what I never did until recent year. Look at the page 3, 4, and 5. And if you look at page 3, 4, and 5, you'll see a list of grievances that the colonials had why they were declaring independence. And if you notice that list, you'll see they all reappear in the Constitution's Bill of Rights. And you have scholars today that, there's no connection between the Declaration and the Constitution. Oh, yeah? Where do you think the ideas for the Bill of Rights came from? Came from the Declaration. And notice the Declaration is Judeo-Christian. Look at it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, I know there were slave owners, but that was an aberration. If you didn't have this, you'd never have any progress ethically through that. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Do you notice two key words here? Two key expressions. Look carefully at this phraseology. They are endowed by the government, or who? By the Creator. And therefore, if the rights come from the Creator and not from the government, what is the conclusion? Right here. What kind of rights? Unalienable. Why are they unalienable? Because no government can take them away. The government can try to take them away, but the government can't take them away inherently. They may beat us, they may kill us, as they are Christians around the world by the tens of thousands. But they can't take the right away. It's still there. Now let's contrast that with Barna's research on America today. They find that the majority of Americans no longer believe that human life has intrinsic value, with 6 out of 10 requesting the fundamental idea that human life is sacred. Stunningly, only 39% of Americans today agree that human life is sacred or is unconditional. Now, if that's really what's happening in our society, then that is going to have consequences. Now, we want to notice something here. When they're talking about every man, are they talking about a class of people, or are they talking about individuals? Let's think through this thing a minute. Let's look at this verse. The Lord commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat thereof you will surely die. How many people was that addressed to? One. Let's look at another one. When I was made and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth, your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed. And in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. Is that addressed to a class of people, or is it addressed to an individual? Addressed to an individual. Let's look at more data from the Bible. The Lord, see. Let me go back here. Yeah. Here's a familiar verse. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. But it starts out with a plural or a singular subject. Singular. He that believes. And then finally, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, talking believers here in the New Testament, that each may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether it be good or bad. Is that addressed to a class, or is that addressed to individuals? Addressed to individuals. Now, what I want to do is I want to go to a textbook given to me by one of the young people who was in this church. They went to a local university, and because you have to take electives and so forth, this girl, she had to take this course. Here's the title of the book. You can tell what's coming. Race, Class, and Gender in the United States. And I just want to read to you the table of contents for the first section of the book. See if you can gather, as I read the titles, of what's going on here. Racial formations, plural. The ethics of living Jim Crow, which would be a legitimate issue. But now listen to the phraseology. constructing race, creating white privilege. Another one, how Jews became white folks. Another one, the social construction of sexuality. We'll get into that in Second Divine Institution. In other words, what they're talking about is a class characteristic that is invented by society. The invention of heterosexuality. Listen to that. The whole chapter. Kids are going to get quizzed on this. The invention of heterosexuality. Here's another one, guys. Masculinity as homophobia. Disability and the justification of inequality in American history. Deconstructing the underclass and so forth. Domination and subordination. And you can just go on and on and on. But it's just another case of what is going on in our culture and the engine that is causing this. The massive investment and effort in the universities. Okay. Takeaway on Divine Institution 1. Divine Institution 1 conveys value and responsibility to individuals. Value and responsibility does not come because society creates it by associating you or your neighbor in a certain class. It starts with God. Let me bluntly show how this works out. If the Bible's view of human nature is wrong, if the founding fathers were misled by the scriptures, no lives matter, no matter what you are. Your life has no meaning, and it does not matter. And we see that. In the 20th century, there's been 30 to 40 to 50 million people butchered by communists who were run by the atheistic view that man has no inherent nature, and if society doesn't grant him value, he doesn't have any value. This is why under Hitler's regime, people, guards, Auschwitz, that were gassing Jewish people, and gassing, by the way, crippled people, anybody that wasn't normal. You know what they do? They go home and listen to Mozart. Why do you suppose they did that? Because it assuaged their conscience. They could do that because they didn't want to be reminded that the people they just gassed were valuable people, and they knew it. So they had to assuage their conscience by going home and listening to Mozart and Beethoven and so forth. Our conclusion. Founding fathers of this great nation saw life and liberty in terms of their Judeo-Christian worldview. There's no debate about that. We do not have to be embarrassed to make that point. 34% of all their referencing materials came from the Bible. Why is this important? It goes back to what we said. It affects the view of our government. It reflects the view that's going on. Now, we're coming up to an election, and a lot of us have families, differences, and we don't want to get in a big argument at home. But let me just suggest a diplomatic, gracious way of responding to someone when they ask you how you're going to vote or who'd you vote for. Here's I think, a way to get the conversation at a better level. You can just reply, I'm trying to live and vote consistently with my worldview. I'm trying to live and vote consistently with my worldview. You haven't answered them directly. You've answered them indirectly, hoping that they'll then ask you, well, what does that mean? And that opens a conversation. But we're struggling here, folks. It's not that we're from one political party to the other. We're just struggling to get clear the way you build a nation with liberty and freedom like we've had. Summary. I want to give 9 lessons about Divine Institution number 1, about individuals, to think of yourself, to think of myself. What does it mean when we say that we are made in God's image? Number 1, We are a creation of a God. Number 2, we are a unique creation among all the things he's created. He has created nothing like we have been created, and now we know why. He wanted to come to this earth and manifest himself, and he was born to a 17, 18-year-old girl, virgin birth, who, by the way, was taught by her mom and her dad with a heavy theology. And if you want to see what that 17 or 18-year-old girl believed, because she'd been taught well and she had thought well, read Luke chapter 1. Number 3, a creature I am held morally accountable to my Creator, who is also my holy, righteous judge. I am responsible. I can't excuse my choices, blaming them on circumstances, blaming them on the fact that I was raised this way or that way. I have to accept personal responsibility for my thinking and my choices, and you do too. Number 4, a creature that is held accountable as an individual, not because I belong to a class. Number 5, I am a creature who lives east of Eden, and therefore unable to overcome my moral unacceptability to my Creator. I am unable by my works to overcome my moral unacceptability to my Creator. I am a creature, number 6, I am continually surrounded by my Creator's designs. I'm continually surrounded by his providential working in my life. I am not ignorant of his existence. Number 7, I'm a creature who in this life can personally come to a personal relationship and meet God and his hand of gracious forgiveness only by coming into contact with his word about his Son. And I only can do that as I either read the writings of Christians or I read the Bible for myself. 8, we all, whether believers in the Bible or not, whether white or black, whether man or woman, whether poor or wealthy, are creatures responsible for our thoughts, words, and actions, and one day will certainly be held individually accountable to our Creator, our Judge, and our Savior. Number 9, the invitation he has given us is still open. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever, any individual, believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. We're going to conclude our service today with a song that Isaac Watts developed from Psalm 90. And Psalm 90 is a psalm of Moses in his elderly life. He said about God, "You have been our dwelling place in all generations. From generation to generation, you are God. Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Let your work appear to your servants. Establish the work of our hands. Establish the work of our hands." And we need God to help us establish the work of our hands in our homes, in our families, and in our communities at this time in our history. So let's reflect on what Isaac Watts put to music from Psalm 90.
Well, thank you, Charlie. Thank you for enlightening us with those words. Thank everybody here for joining us today. We'll close and dismiss our service, and I think it's just a reminder that the time that we're living in, this has kind of been on my heart for quite some time, that I really feel like now is the time for Christians to live out what we say we believe. It's one thing for us to share with those around us that we believe in Christ, that we're followers of Christ, but if they don't see anything different, then are we really pointing to Christ in that? Just think about that this week as you're living and going about your daily routine. If you're feeling anxious or if you're struggling with how to receive everything that's going on, just recognize that you're a child of the King. And so it's time to live that out. Have a great week.